Hi, my name is Larry Aber, and I am pleased to welcome you to an NYU Abu Dhabi Institute sponsored webinar entitled Improving Education for Refugee Children. And the emphasis of this webinar is on insights from rigorous research. I'm delighted to be joined by my two colleagues, Dr. Yeon Kim and Dr. Lindsay Brown, who are exceptional young researchers at NYU TIES, and they will be presenting much of our work to you today. The research, if you could go to the next slide, the research today is part of a program of research conducted by a research center that spans NYU New York and NYU Abu Dhabi. It is called Global Ties for Children, and TIES stands for the purpose to which we do the research. We wish to help governments and NGOs and communities transform the interventions that they implement for children in low-income and conflict-affected countries to improve their effectiveness and their scale at improving children's holistic outcomes. Right, next. Our work historically has focused on two stages of childhood: early childhood, 0 to 5, and middle childhood, roughly 6 to 11 or 12. We're increasingly doing work in adolescence as well. And we always ask 4 questions. These are the questions that motivate our work. What works to improve children's holistic learning outcomes? How does it work? For whom? Under what conditions? And at what cost? Next slide. We do this work in currently 4 regions of the world. Our primary focus when we began in 2014 was in the Middle East and North Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa, but we've continued to build work in Latin America and in Asia. Next. And all this work can't be done alone. They involve very important and very complex strategic partnerships between funders, governments, non-governmental organizations, local communities, and research centers like NYU TIES. All of the examples that Yeon and Lindsay will be presenting today come from a 10-year partnership we've had with the International Rescue Committee. And we've focused over those 10 years in work in the Democratic Republic of Congo, Niger, and Sierra Leone in Africa, and Lebanon in the Middle East. And I will return to make a few comments about the importance of strategic partnerships at the end of our presentation. So this is the plans for the next 45 minutes. Lindsay Brown is going to begin by summarizing some of the current conditions facing refugee children that seem especially important to us. Then Yeon Kim will focus on work we've been doing to try to improve the instructional quality in classrooms of programs for children in conflict-affected situations by infusing social-emotional learning principles into those programs. Lindsay Brown will then say that if the kids don't attend, they don't get as big an impact. Then we'll cover the critical role of attendance. Then we'll return to Yeon Kim to describe work we've been doing to try to fill some of the gaps in our early work where we weren't discovering what we hoped we would. And finally, I'll have a few comments on strategic partnerships, as we said. If we're good and we finish that all in 40 minutes, we'll have plenty of time for discussion. So with no further delays, let me turn things over to my colleague, Lindsay. Lindsay, take it away.
Thanks. I just wanted to pause for a minute and see if our colleagues from Abu Dhabi wanted to say anything.
I think what they wanted to say was in the greetings.
Is in the chat. Okay, great. So We wanted to take just a minute and talk about the conditions in the areas in which we work and in which our on-the-ground partners work. So this talk is going to focus primarily on our partnership with the International Rescue Committee, which, as many of you know, is an organization for emergency relief. And it works primarily in places of conflict and crisis. So that's where we're going to focus talking about these conditions. As all of us know, we are facing unprecedented times, so this work is more important now than it's ever been. The global pandemic aside, there are now nearly 80 million refugees and displaced people around the world. More than 3/4 of refugees are displaced for more than 5 years. So it's really a much more stable and sort of chronic condition than a lot of people realize. And 4 out of every 5 refugees or internally displaced people live in developing countries. So these host communities are often dealing with their own pre-existing social, political, economic challenges prior to the arrival of refugees or displaced people. This is also figures prior to the pandemic. Drilling down to school-aged kids in those places, 260 million school-aged children are out of school, 35% of whom live in conflict-affected contexts. And even when students are in school, of course, there are many challenges to them learning, and we're going to talk more about what some of those challenges are in a little bit. But we know that education for vulnerable children is especially important, and it can provide a sense of normalcy and structure. And when it's done well, it can have really high returns, both for learning and for later life outcomes. Over 1 billion students have experienced school disruption in 2020, mostly from the effects of COVID-19. And we don't know yet exactly what the amount of learning loss will be or how this will affect children. But what we do know from prior research is that prolonged closures tend to have disproportionately negative impacts on the most vulnerable students. And this is for a lot of reasons, some of which are there's fewer opportunities for those students to learn at home on average. It has cascading effects to their parents who no longer have places to send their kids, creates complications for their work. Lack of services, access through school, such as meals or counselors, and extended school closures can cause not just a loss of learning, which is sort of the most proximate outcome, but also, the long-term goals of schooling in terms of development of human capital can also be disrupted. And this is especially important because in conflict and crisis contexts, children are exposed to a number of environmental risks like violence, instability, and other things in their harsh environments. And extended exposure to risks can overwhelm a child's ability to cope. And that can lead to a toxic stress, which can cause physiological disruption in healthy brain development and can prevent children from reaching their full potential. And this can happen both in academic learning as well as other kinds of well-being, such as pro-social behavior, like learning how to get along with others, and also knowing how and when to regulate their emotions. And this is really the chain that we're working with the IRC to try to disrupt. So we're focusing on program and policy interventions. In this talk, we're focusing specifically on Healing Classrooms, which is a curriculum that was developed by the International Rescue Committee specifically for children in conflict and crisis areas to ensure that children can reach their potential, and particularly, again, focusing on academic and social-emotional outcomes in this talk. And so with that, Yeon is going to take over and talk about what evidence we've generated so far with Healing Classrooms.
Thank you, Lindsay, for the introduction, and thank you everyone for coming to our talk today. Like Lindsay said, we are now going to talk about what we can do to support the refugee education undergoing adversity and toxic stress with examples from our research in democratic Republic of Congo, Lebanon, and Niger. Just a little bit of background. Recently, UNHCR released a new strategy for refugee inclusion titled Refugee Education 2030. This document is an update of their 2012 to 2016 global education strategy. And here they emphasize that education for displaced children and youth and their host communities requires collective global responsibility. To do so, they call for integration of refugee children in national education systems and providing safe, enabling environment for all students for both refugee and host community children. As a strategy to achieve these goals, it emphasized the role of global community and stakeholders to support host country governments to provide high quality education and ease the pressure on host country government through sustainable partnership with global stakeholders. Given this responsibility as a part of a global community, we need to think about what is the best way to support refugee children in national education systems for the universities like NYU and in partnership with NGOs and funders and other stakeholders. What can we do and what role can we play to improve quality and access to education for refugee children with accountability and effectiveness? We present two solutions addressing this question in the following section. With the evidence from the work that we have done through strategic research practitioner partnership between NYU TIES and IRC. The first solution that we propose is to improve access to and quality of education in support of local host country governments. We can do so by providing innovative and high quality academic curriculum and teacher training. This can be done both in support of the existing formal school system, the refugee and the host community children attend, and also it can be done in complementary provision of informal education services that help children to learn better and stay longer in national education systems. The second solution is to provide socio-emotional support for the students, but it can be done by embedding social-emotional support strategies within the education. That can be an effective solution to ensure education services to provide safe and enabling environment for refugee and host community children facing many adversities in crisis-affected contexts and promote holistic learning. There are many innovative programs and work going on in the field that address these issues, but so far, very little research has been done in these areas. As university researchers, we believe our contribution and responsibility is to generate evidence of what works and how to make it better. One promising solution our practitioner partner IRC brought to the table is providing academic curriculum that is infused with SEL principles designed to provide safe and enabling environment for learning. The innovation of this program is to infuse 5 SEL principles to the classroom instructional practices, not only to provide academic support, but also to provide safe and supportive environment. This program is called Healing Classroom, and in addition to the curriculum, it provides teacher training, peer learning communities called teacher learning circles, and coaching support. This program has been tested in a few different countries via different delivery platforms. The first model is to provide this SEL-infused program directly to the public schools. This model has been implemented in Congo and Sierra Leone. The goal of this program, this model, is to support holistic learning within the national education systems for all children, including both refugees, IDPs, and host community children. And it is typically delivered by public school teachers within the regular school days, and this approach is focused on improving the formal education itself. The first place this model has been tested was Congo in the first ever large-scale evaluation study conducted by partnership between IRC and NYU TIES. The results are promising. We found that Healing Classroom can improve students' academic skills for both reading and math. We also found this program improved children's sense of safety and supportedness of their schools. But it did not improve children's and teachers' mental health and well-being, and most of these effects disappear once the program is expanded and followed up in the later years. The second model is to provide SEL-infused program as an NGO-run non-formal remedial programming provided outside of the formal schooling systems and days. This is to support children's holistic learning in non-formal remedial education for students to succeed in national education systems. There are some variations in who delivered it, to whom, to what level of coordination with the Ministry of Education, the host community government have happened, differ by the country that we implemented. We are focusing on the Lebanon and Niger here. In testing this model in Lebanon, we also found similar promising findings. We found that Healing Classroom can improve some of the children's reading and math skills, but not all. We also found that access to this informal remedial education program improved children's perceptions of public school climate, including sense of safety and supportedness of the schools. And interestingly, we also found significant impact on behavior regulation, but other than that, there was no impact on socio-emotional learning or mental health we found from this program. In Niger, we similarly found that a Healing Classroom significantly improved children's literacy skills and numeracy skills, like DRC and Lebanon. But we also found that Healing Classroom did not improve their school grades in public schools. We also confirmed these findings were not different across gender, refugee status, and academic skill levels of the child. With evidence from these three countries, what do we know about Healing Classrooms? First, we have evidence that this SEL-infused education program can improve academic outcomes and students' perception of safety and supportiveness in schools. And this is consistent across 3 countries and 2 different delivery models, including formal education settings in public schools in DRC and NGO-run informal education programs in Lebanon and Niger. However, we also found that Healing Classroom does not work to improve teachers' and students' well-being, nor the social emotional skills that we hope to improve as a part of this program. Based on this learning, we now turn to ways to understand and improve the programs for children in the crisis context. First, by focusing on improving attendance, and second, by improving targeted programs for improving social-emotional learning. Now we turn to Dr. Lindsay Brown, who will discuss issues around the attendance.
Thanks, Yeon. So now that we've learned a little bit about how the program works, I want to turn to talking about attendance to the program itself, because it turns out it's not quite as simple as if you build it, they will come. So what have we learned about attendance? What we know is that in conflict-affected contexts, there are a lot of factors that can impede student attendance. There's high levels of mobility within the population. A lot of times they live in areas with harsh weather. There can be school closures due to things like strikes or elections. And oftentimes there's unsafe security conditions to and from school. And all of these can contribute to reasons why students don't come to school. And what we know, of course, about attendance is that it's related to the amount of curriculum that students get exposed to. And it's also related to the consistency and quantity of the practice opportunities that they have to practice the skills and processes and strategies within that curriculum. And also just how much students come to school can affect the stability of the classroom environment beyond the student himself, sort of among the peers. And at the very least, it's a necessary precondition for academic learning. Yet, what we've found in the programs, this is empirical data, is that the average attendance ranges across countries from 40% in Lebanon, which was a community-based program that was happening outside of the public school system, to 60 and 64% in Sierra Leone and Niger. Those were happening either within or alongside the public school system. And so, on average, students are receiving about half of the curriculum that was designed really thoughtfully and sequentially by the International Rescue Committee. Again, this is empirical evidence from from the program in Niger. And what we found is that even at lower than desirable attendance, the effect sizes of academic learning are small at about 0.2 in reading to moderate at about 0.3 in math, which is comparable with other sorts of programs in the area. And yet what we know is that if 100%, if students attended 100% of the time, we would double the amount of learning that students did in the same amount of time with the same curriculum. And the reason why we're particularly interested, again, in focusing in on attendance is that it's a fairly actionable target. So thinking about, things that may impede student learning, attendance is something where we have a fair amount of low or no cost options. So one of the things that we've seen either in the literature or in our own work is that dropping the requirement of school uniforms is one way to get students to attend more often. Having volunteer community groups monitor students' attendance and go out into the community and raise awareness. In the IRC, that tends to be mothers groups, but there's no gender necessity to that. Ensuring that there are safe routes for students to get to and from school. Having incentives for student attendance, and this can be in the younger grades as easy as having students put a sticker on a calendar each time they come into class. That's been shown to improve attendance. And also having benefits through the school itself, such as school feeding programs. All of these things are low or no cost options to increase attendance and ultimately learning. And we actually know surprisingly little about attendance in the sort of context where we work, and that might be surprising because attendance is sort of ubiquitous in more developed areas. But really, the focus has historically been on access in low resourced contexts. So, is there a school that students can access that's a reasonable distance away with low or no fees, that sort of thing? And attendance is surprisingly challenging to measure. I'm going to talk about our attempts to do so in just a second. And programs can face well or unintended incentives for turnover. So one of the things that programs generally report on is the number of beneficiaries in the program. There's always limited resources. And so usually when a student drops out or stops coming consistently, you can replace that student with someone new. And then the number of beneficiaries increases, which is often a donor metric that programs use. And so this actually incentivizes in some way this sort of churn that is not as good for actual student learning outcomes. I just want to focus in for a minute on attendance being challenging to measure, because it feels like, oh, this is very discrete. It should be really easy. So I want to talk for a minute about when we wanted to get daily student attendance from Sierra Leone. Teachers already take attendance in a booklet that looks like this. This is an actual picture from the attendance booklet. They take attendance twice a day. A downstroke means the student was there in the morning, and upstroke means they were there in the afternoon. Zeros mean they were absent. But the data is not entered anywhere electronically, and it's not aggregated in any way, and the Blue Books are not allowed to leave the school. So we tried various methods for getting more for getting more efficient at collecting the data. But ultimately, we decided that we were going to just take pictures of this attendance that already existed in the environment. And this ended up being, this is one of the pictures that we received. This is another picture that we received. And so part of the challenge was getting legible data. And then even when it was legible, oftentimes it was separated from the names themselves, or it wasn't filled out with the dates at the top. And so we ended up creating a really intricate tracker for each school and each classroom. At the end of each month, was the data uploaded? Was it legible? And continuously feeding back to our partners on the ground, please re-upload this. And it was incredibly time consuming, both for on our end and also on our partners' end, in order to try to get this attendance, even prior to when we actually digitized the information itself. So what can we do moving forward? We have invested some resources along with our partners in trying to get real-time electronic reporting of attendance. That has been happening on the ground, primarily in Lebanon. Invest in school data systems so that this data is aggregated and used so that it can be used in real time to monitor progress. Improve donor metrics to not incentivize churn in programs, and investigate barriers and promoters of attendance, because these are likely to be context specific and to change depending on the environment. And again, what we know, just to drive home this point, is that if students were to go 100% of the time, they would have twice the amount of learning. And that's really why we're so interested in attendance. And now Yeon is going to talk a little bit about our experience iterating on and collecting evidence of skill-targeted SEL strategies.
Thank you, Lindsay. Like Lindsay discussed, improving attendance is really the key to improving the program effectiveness in general. Another way to improve the education program for refugee children is to provide programs directly targeting social-emotional learning for children. In this section, I'm going to talk about the potential solutions and focusing on the evidence that we found from NYUAD's and IRC's strategic partnership work in Lebanon. So the rationale behind why we targeting SEL could be helpful for improving refugee education largely stems from the robust evidence that exists in the Western research, suggesting that social-emotional learning is critical for children's learning and well-being. The social-emotional learning could be even more important for the children who are going through the adversities that affects the range of social and emotional and cognitive development in conflict-affected settings. However, the trial of the IRC's Healing Classroom programs, integrating the classroom level SEL principles and practices into teacher training and curriculum, didn't show improvement in children's social emotional learning. So IRC and NYUAD tested if adding a program or programs that directly target the social emotional skills can bolster the effect of the Healing Classroom on children's social emotional learning skills and mental health. So we categorize the SEL programs broadly into three types. The first type we discuss is the classroom SEL, which we already talked about. So this is an approach to integrate the classroom level SEL practices into the instruction itself. This type of program focuses on providing safe and supportive classroom environment and does not necessarily directly target the building's specific SEL skills. The Healing Classroom is a good example of this, and we already shared the findings from that program. In this section, we will be focusing on two other types that can be added onto the classroom SEL, like Healing Classroom. So the first is skill-targeted SEL activities. These are usually consisting of short activities and games that target specific SEL skills. For example, cognitive skills and so on, and possibly can be delivered within a normal school days between subject transition time. For our research, we focused on testing mindfulness and brain games activities. Secondly, we also have a skill-targeted SEL curriculum, which is different from skill-targeted activities in that it consists of planned sequence of standalone lessons incorporating multiple different types of method and instructions to build specific SEL skills it targets. We also tested such a program called 5-component SEL delivered by IRC in Lebanon. So first, the skill-targeted SEL activities in Lebanon, we tested this in 2016 and 17. IRC implemented two types of skill-targeted social-emotional learning activities called mindfulness and brain games, in addition to the healing classrooms program that you see on the left. The mindfulness targets to improve children's stress and emotional regulation skills through breathing and mind-body down regulation activities. And the other program, brain games, targets to improve children's executive function skills, for example, attention, working memory, and inhibition, which are the critical cognitive functions that's necessary for learning. Both of these activities were implemented for 3 times a day, which each of those were 10-minute sessions, and 3 days a week for 16 weeks each for each of the programs, while the Healing Classroom program was in session. The NYUAD and IRC conducted the rigorous evaluation of these skill-targeted SEL activities in Lebanon, with hopes to improve children's social emotional learning skills that these programs target. Disappointingly, however, we found no robust evidence of impacts either of the mindfulness nor of the brain games alone by the rigorous statistical standards. What we found, however, is some promising and some worrisome signs that we can use to improve the programming itself. So specifically, we found that some positive signals that indicates mindfulness and brain games have potential to improve children's social and emotional learning skills in a positive direction for 2 outcomes, including decreasing aggression and helping students to better regulate their emotions. We also found some negative signals that mindfulness and brain games have potential to affect children's outcomes, maybe in negative ways, such as increasing children's stress levels, self-reported stress levels about the school-related issues. So based on these findings, the next year, 2017 to 18, IRC and NYU partnership decided to test out a different type of SEL program, a skill-targeted SEL curriculum. So the program on the right side, it targets 5 different components of SEL skills, including brain building, emotional regulation, positive social skills, conflict resolution, and perseverance in explicit lessons about SEL. It was implemented 30 minutes lessons each day for 3 days a week for 24 weeks. So the findings are a little disappointing again. We found overall no robust evidence of impacts of 5-component SEL. We still found, however, some, again, promising and worrisome signs that we can use to improve the programming. Specifically, we found some positive signals that 5-component SEL have potential to improve children's SEL skills in a positive direction for multiple outcomes, including improving emotional knowledge and also teacher perceptions of positive academic and social behaviors of their children. We also found some negative signals, including the 5-component program may increase students' report and awareness of their negative emotions. These indications are not robust enough to say, give us a conclusive evidence to say the 5-component program or the mindfulness or brain games had positive or negative impacts. But these information gives us the directions for program revision and improvement. Overall, the conclusion from the evaluation of the skill-targeted SEL programs is that moving the SEL needle is really hard in these contexts, and we don't really know yet how to do that effectively just yet. And yes, this is quite disheartening. However, this also provides a reason to continue innovating and improving and building evidence base for SEL programming crisis context. It just shows us that it really takes a lot of courage and perseverance and investment to innovate and improve the programs and conduct research to learn how to improve the refugee education. And the research so far also provides a lot of opportunities. There are a lot of information and promising signals that we can use to revise and improve the programs and also implementation and better understand the child development and bring new innovation to the programs. Based on the learning from these research that we have done so far, we are working on a few next steps. These includes for research, working on collective development of measures in context, also better understanding child development in context, and understanding and improving program implementation and heterogeneity in context. For programming and partnerships, we are continuing to working on identifying and developing innovative programs that can improve children's mental health and SEL skills. We are also collaborating with host community governments to develop framework and tools for better monitoring and evaluation of the socio-emotional learning and academic learning. And lastly, we are trying to moving away from the model of capacity building. We are investing in building new model of capacity exchange for the partnerships. Now I turn to Larry for discussion on the role of the partnerships. Larry?
I was muted. Thank you, Yeon. Thank you, Yeon and Lindsay, for really rich presentations. We know, colleagues, we've taxed you with a lot of information, and we are monitoring the Q&A, and so please continue with Q&A, and we'll have a chance to clarify some of your questions. But before we end, I just wanted to step back for a few minutes. Yeon and Lindsay have been right in the depths of the research about what we're learning about what works. And I want to take a moment and zoom back out to the process by which all this happens. Everything that Yeon and Lindsay described could not have been accomplished by INGOs alone, universities alone, without support from governments and involvement, without funders, and most especially without the local communities. So these are very complex research enterprises. They're research action enterprises. And it's worth thinking about what are the assets and the benefits that come from them. Next slide, Yeon, please. So from my point of view, and I think our collective point of view at TIES, but maybe not the world's, there are unique assets that universities bring to such strategic partnerships. It's not obvious to all of you that an enormous amount of the work that IRC draws on to inform the design of their programs and that we draw on to inform the rigorous evaluation of their programs involve advances in social, behavioral, developmental, educational, prevention, and improvement sciences. Universities are in direct access to and develop these kinds of scientific advances. And it's a potential asset if it's used well and respectively and truly reciprocally. It's a potential tool to improve the functioning of government and NGOs. It's also, as Yeon mentioned, it takes courage to do so. So we'd like to publicly thank the International Rescue Committee for their commitment to evidence-based practice. They have been on a 25-year mission, especially acute in the last 10 years, to try to move humanitarian relief and development aid to an evidence-based approach. We believe that the role of universities in helping to do that through accessing science tools and concepts is one unique asset of the university. The second enormous unique asset of the university is mobilization of the human capital of the university students. University students have the capacity to make contributions that we're only beginning to explore in all this work. Certainly, doctoral and postdoctoral fellows do it, but master's and undergraduate students can do it. And there's great interest in places like NYU Abu Dhabi and NYU New York among undergraduates in being engaged in this kind of work. Next slide. But we not only bring assets that may benefit strategic partnerships, but we also benefit, universities benefit from these kinds of partnerships. Universities have the ability to contribute directly and powerfully to the advancement of sustainable development goals in multiple areas, whether it's poverty, health, in our case, education, Sustainable Development Goal 4. The ability for universities to actually make contributions to societal development, I think, is tangible in this work. Additionally, this kind of work is eye-opening to students about the complexity of real-world problem solving that will undertake them if they go into these kinds of work careers in the future. So opportunities to better prepare students for that is a great benefit of having students be involved and universities being involved. All this leads to opening pathways for evidence-based policies and practices. Kids don't deserve us guessing what might work for them. Kids deserve us knowing as well as we can and disciplining ourselves to be able to make that commitment to the iterative, continuous improvement that IRC has been championing, that we're trying to assist, and that there are other wonderful examples of this going on around the world. So that's great. In my final moments, I want to do two other things. First, next slide, is to get concrete, not abstract about this. It takes all sectors to do of strategic partnerships to do this. We've already heard about how critical our partnership is with the International Rescue Committee, both in their central offices, their headquarters, which is actually a globally dispersed headquarters even before the pandemic, and in their country teams. And so it's impossible to name all the education directors, research directors, program coordinators, research officers, data collectors in the teams. This work could not be done without that. There have been a number of funders funding this kind of research practice partnership work. We especially are grateful to Dubai Cares, who has taken a real leadership role in that. But there are other funders too that are seeing the value of this kind of work and that have supported our work, and we thank them. Collaborations with colleagues at other universities have been useful in accessing some of that high science that we've been talking about. And then besides Yeon, Lindsay, and I, there are many other NYU colleagues who work on the school-age children's work. I haven't mentioned at all that IRC and NYU collaborate on early childhood work too, led by my colleague Hiro Yoshikawa, who co-directs the center, and many talented people there. Finally, the children, parents, teachers, and ministry officials on the ground in the countries are generous with their time, open to be understood, and it's critical. Finally, we would like to thank the NYU Abu Dhabi Research Institute for providing the invaluable core support to ties that has enabled us to strengthen our ties across our center, our university, the MENA, UAE and MENA region, and around the globe in pursuit of Sustainable Development Goal 4 and other efforts to support children in their futures. We are extremely grateful, and we are thank you for your attention, and we're going to now turn to questions and answers. Okay. Yeon and Lindsay have been scanning. I tried to answer a few of the questions already. They've been answered. Please do enter your questions in there. Lindsay, have you identified an outstanding question that you'd like us to address?
Yeah, so I think Yeon is probably best suited to answer this question, but this question is about whether we found any specific SEL skills had a greater impact on learning outcomes and well-being.
Yes, we are continuing to actually working on understanding how the SEL skills works in relationship with the learning outcomes and well-being in the context for the population that we are working with. We don't assume that this will be the same as the Western research, the evidence from the Western research. We recently have done a study on the Syrian refugee children in Lebanon, and it tells us that it is the cognitive skills, especially the working memory skills, that are actually sensitive to a lot of early exposure to conflicts and violence, can be critical for academic learning, and so are the behavior regulation skills that are being able to control your urges and behaviors in the context of academic settings.
So if
go ahead.
I was just going to elaborate a little bit. So if exposure to some of the risks associated with being a refugee really hurt children's ability to hold information in short-term memory, for instance, the ability to remember what the beginning of a sentence was about when you get to the end of a sentence, when you're learning reading, or behavioral regulation, where you just can't regulate yourself enough to pay attention. Yeon's describing risks affecting those processes, and that those processes have a very powerful effect on kids' ability to read and learn reading skills and math skills. And those are exactly why Brain Games targets those processes. By a similar process, we also know that there are other features of risk that affect children's emotion regulation. And it looks like emotion regulation may have a stronger influence on social emotional outcomes and less on academic outcomes. And working memory and those kinds of executive functions have a stronger influence on academic outcomes and a little less on social emotional outcomes. If that is true, it means that if we want to target both academic learning and social emotional learning, we got a lot of work to do. Yeon, have you identified a question that you think is one we can answer now?
Yes. It's a little, I need a little bit of time to think through how to answer this question, so I'm going to pose it to Larry. Okay. In terms of global and local history, in what ways would that be taught in school, as well as what sensitive topics should be talked about? Sorry, it just moved away.
I'm sorry. That was my fault.
Let me just find the question again. Yeah. talked about towards refugee of war per se. So what kind of sensitive topics can be taught for the refugee children, and how do we think refugees would emotionally cope with the information, and what information should be taught?
This is an enormously important question in our opinion, and sadly, we have relatively little to say about it through our own research. There is evidence that some forms of school curricula reinforce bias and increase the probability of intergroup conflict, and some topics inhibit bias and reduce the probability of intergroup conflict. There is a literature on the content of textbooks, for instance, that is related to that. And it's a very important topic. We attempt to be very respectful of what country curricula and IRC years of practice lead to their notions about how they want to be changing practices. So we as a research center do not create programs or interventions. We help NGOs and governments think more clearly about whether it works or not, and for what purposes. So, but Yeon or Lindsay, do you have any additional things to in response to that question, now that Yeon made me answer it first?
Yes. So there is two different layers of this. The first is the topic itself, the sensitive political and social cultural issues that that needs to be dealt with a lot of care and sensitivity to that, especially in a context in a host community working with refugee children from another country. There's another layer which is the socio-emotional skills that we are trying to promote. So one of the programs that we implemented is Mindfulness program, and there was actually a lot of concerns around whether that making the kids to reflect on their emotions and experience may have a negative impact on their outcomes, especially for the children who have experienced trauma and war, conflict, and so on. At least from what we can say from evidence from the two regions, from Niger and from Lebanon, we haven't seen very negative impacts of those programs. We actually kept it to a more body and emotion regulation that is more directly geared towards being in the current state, rather than thinking about their memories or past or traumas and so on. And it actually seemed to have some promising signs. So, but that's just to say, we need to think about how and what type of skills that we want to focus on improving children to learn in this context.
Yeah, and last thing is that, we are classifying some of these as promising or, potential warning signs. But the truth is that we don't really know what's adaptive in these contexts for refugees yet. So like Yeon was saying, being more aware or more willing to say that you're sad or that you're angry, it looks on a measure like you've gotten angrier, but that might not actually be the case. It might be you're more aware of that feeling than you were before. And so so we're really wading through a lot of this in real time is sort of the other thing to point out.
And it's why researchers in this area will stay busy for a long time. Let me briefly respond to two types of questions. One question is, can you get copies of the slides? Will there be a recording available? And my understanding is that in the chat, NYU Abu Dhabi has described that the webinar is being recorded and it'll be posted on a YouTube channel, and you can go to a certain place. So look at the chat function for information about how to access the material later. A second question was raised a number of times, has to do with our research methods, and two types of methods. Most of what we described, it comes from randomized field experiments where we ethically and sensitively, in collaboration with communities and governments, decide to roll out services over random different start points, as an example. So everybody will eventually get the service, but some children and schools get it earlier than others. And so you can compare the ones who randomly got it earlier to the ones who randomly got it later. So, but field experiments are very challenging to run in a good way, in a sensitive way, and in a rigorous way. We could talk all day about that. The second has to do with how do you measure the processes and outcomes? And we have an entire initiative led by our colleague Carly Tubbs-Dolan and her colleague Roxanne Kairas, who on developing measures and metrics to do this kind of work. So, but in general, we try to use reliable, valid, and culturally pre-tested and adapted measures of concepts that seem to be emerging from the broader scientific literature. As has been mentioned by my colleagues twice, however, we should make no cultural assumptions about whether they're relevant or not. We should test and explore. And one of the things we found is how important and valuable it would be to spend a year preparing for a study or more to really understand local culture, to really try to have the measures reflected as fully as possible the cultural knowledge and values of an area. The way funds go in this area is humanitarian relief organizations and government donors want to get services to kids yesterday. Mm-hmm. And researchers want to prepare to study that tomorrow. And that time conflict means that it's another part of the strategic partnership that needs to be worked through. Mm-hmm. Go ahead, Yeon.
I just may add to the questions about the tools for measuring SEL skills. There is actually really great resource at the INEE website. We have the measurement and matrix library that's hosted by INEE, and there's actually a great webinar showcasing a few of those measures, I believe, this Thursday. So please check that out as well.
And INEE stands for the International Network on Education in Emergencies, and is a great, is the leading cross-national organization of folks interested and committed to the field of education in emergencies. Mm-hmm. We're nearly at the end of our time. Yeon or Lindsay, is there any? We'll attempt to answer all the other questions. Thank you for all your questions. I see that our colleague Carly Tubbs-Dolan has already sent the link to INEE. Thank you, Carly. I see our colleague Jess Castellan encouraging people to be in touch on social media about the work of TIES. But Yeon or Lindsay, any final question that you think we can answer?
I think this till 11, if I'm not mistaken.
No, I think it runs till 10. Oh, is that correct?
That's my understanding. Yeah.
I think you're right. No, it's your understanding because it's true. So that's great. Okay.
Reality.
Now I can take a deep breath. And so, other questions we want to address.
I can answer this question, and please, Larry and Lindsay, if you feel free to follow up. Frida asks, have there been any efforts to alter SEL curriculum formats for delivery in home settings as a response to COVID-19? So far, we have not specifically for SEL programs yet. We are planning to do so in the future work. And we are also, we actually have for early childhood development side, we have a media, the socio-emotional learning programs using the media, working with the Sesame workshop. So maybe Larry, you can introduce that a little bit, but that could be more adaptive for COVID settings.
Yes. So the early childhood colleagues at NYU Ties are working with early childhood colleagues at the International Rescue Committee in collaboration with Sesame Street and to do two big sets of programs and evaluations of those programs, one in the Syrian refugee response region, Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, and the other in Bangladesh in Cox's Bazar, the big refugee community of Rohingya who migrated, been forced to migrate to Bangladesh. In both of those, the work we described to you, the program work existed pre-pandemic. So we were still doing face-to-face programming and face-to-face research. Our early childhood colleagues were in the middle of beginning to roll out and conduct research when the pandemic hit. So they've had to powerfully pivot to distance or remote programming and distance or remote modes of evaluation. Now, the fact that Sesame Street was part of it made it partly already possible for broadcast media and certain kinds of electronic things to get Sesame Street programming that's been reshaped for the Syrian refugee response region into the hands of people without face-to-face contact. But there is, for instance, that's for kids 3 to 5. For kids under 2, there is a mother-child, and if the father is a primary caretaker, a father-child home visitation program that used stimulation and support strategies in a face-to-face way. Our colleagues have had to totally reinvent that to become a deliverable by phone, and that's a very significant challenge. Did I answer the question as you posed it to me, Yeon?
I think so. Okay, so I'm gonna ask this question to Lindsay. This is a question by Rita. Is the delivery of the teacher training collective in the sense of that the teachers embedded in the local community are involved in the design of the training and are the ones delivering it?
Great question, Rita. So I think a thing to understand about Healing Classrooms is that it was a sort of grassroots movement at the beginning. The people at IRC were hearing from teachers on the ground that they needed a curriculum and an approach that was suitable for students in conflict affected areas. And the program is contextualized within each of the programs. It is not co-constructed in each area, and the local community members are involved in the training, but often not the ones primarily delivering it. We do have work. TIES has some work in Lebanon where we are working with the government and with the coaches, co-facilitating and co-constructing some teacher professional development there. And we do believe that this is a great method for buy-in, for sustainability. And we can report in the future about some of how that work is going. But because the approach is sort of already developed in some way for Healing Classrooms, it is contextualized and did come at inception from teachers, but it is not, wholly redeveloped for each context.
That's terrific. Let me address questions by Pamela and by Yusuf. Pamela asks if we get to work with home settings, parents, families to improve school outcomes. And the answer is yes in early childhood and not no in the school age years. Not because we don't think it's important, but because of resource constraints and logistic constraints. And we follow the lead of IRC and government in their wisdom of what should be designed and evaluated. We provide lots of input and feedback and constructive criticism and things like that, but it's not our decision. It's the government and NGO's decision, and that would be another way. There's a variety of ways of thinking about how to strengthen the effects of these programs. We've talked about two, which is learning better how what social emotional processes could be targeted more effectively to get to outcomes, and ways to improve attendance. But creating a positive echo chamber between home and school is a very promising approach to doing this. And simply increasing what's called in the research literature the dosage of a program. These programs are run for anywhere between 8 and 16 weeks, once or twice a year, and we're devoting about 30 minutes a week a day, 3 times a week on these targeted things. Maybe if the dosage went up, maybe if the attendance went up, that would be a way of improving things. Joseph asked the question, do you think that program would be as effective for a young child whose abusive parents or orphan under horrible conditions? This is an example of 2 things. The first is we're reporting average effects of these programs. And once we said those average effects were true for boys and girls and for relatively younger and relatively older kids, and 1 or 2 other comments like that. But how individual and family factors influence children's responses to an intervention is what we technically refer to as examining the heterogeneity of the impact, the variation in impact by characteristics. And that's another area that we're going to be looking at a lot more closely. In general, we find when things work, they work for everybody. When they don't work for anybody. That's the finding so far, but we haven't done that. I'll give one big example of an exception. We had no average effect on teacher well-being in the Democratic Republic of Congo, but that's because it had a positive impact on male teachers' well-being and a negative impact on female teachers' well-being. Now, that surprised us. We thought, if anything, because the message of healing classrooms seemed a more nurturing, not to engage in gender stereotypes, approach, that it might be received more fully by female teachers. So if we had any hypotheses about gender differences, it would have been that. But in retrospect, when we realized that 75 or 80% of the teachers in our study were male and 20 or 25% were female, and that the teacher learning circles was the main mode of peer learning, we realized that we were putting women inadvertently in a minority position in that and maybe they experienced some gender dynamics that were untoward. Now, we don't know that, but it's the kind of thing that you discover and you need to try to figure out more of. Hi, Yeon and Lindsay, any additional comments on things from Pamela or Yusuf's questions?
No, just to add, Pamela also asked whether we collected any information from the parents. We do have parents' demographic information. We also have some of the teachers' perceptions of their own working environment. So we are in a process of understanding that better and potentially understand the impact on the children's outcomes by those factors, by their family context and also the teachers. But that is to be coming. That's also, there's a similar question by David in a way that it's addressing the heterogeneity of the impact, which is could the implementation of the intervention therefore have different effects in the two classroom environment? So this is depending on, we definitely had some differences between how we implemented, who delivered it, who was the target of the implementation, and where things happened. For example, in Lebanon, the classrooms were within the communities. So it's a community-based programs. In Niger, the afternoon school, the remedial program, it was an informal program, but still happened within a school as a part of the after school program and delivered by public schools. And that could have affected the differences in impact, but it's still a very different context. So we are actually in the process of understanding what's the role of implementation by comparing the classrooms and teachers within each of those contexts and see whether what are the best ways to implement those findings. Lindsay, do you want to add anything to that?
No, I don't think so.
Mm-hmm.
I would like to answer this question about opportunities for practice. So Avi's asking about opportunities for practice and whether that might play a role in the difference between what we might have expected as the impact and what we saw. I'd like to preface this by saying this is purely my hypothesis for what happened. I think, we are counting on teachers to do so much in these environments. I'm a former classroom teacher. I'm a huge champion of teachers. And I think one of my hypotheses is that the teachers weren't able to extrapolate to communicate to the students that these were strategies that they could use, that were transferable, that were flexible, that they could integrate into their daily lives, which was specifically part of the activity. And it was something that they were taught in the training. But, in a lot of places, the teachers aren't used to sort of facilitating these kinds of discussions with students. And what we saw when we either did observations or in the videos that we have is that teachers really truncated this part of the activities, and I think that was in what we see in the research is that students don't make that extrapolation on their own. They don't say, oh, I did this fun breathing activity with my teacher. Let me, apply it on my own in this other context. The more explicit teachers can be that this is a flexible and transferable tool, the more that students will integrate that in other places. So that's one of my hypotheses about why we didn't see as much of an impact. And like Larry said, dosage, I think, is another big culprit as well, probably.
That's great. I see one other question that I suggest we respond to. Then I'm going to pose a brief question to both Lindsay and Yeon, and then we'll wrap it up. So first of all, we're humbled that 120 of you began and 83 of you are still hanging in there. So thank you so much for being so engaged in trying to understand what we've been doing here. The question I want to address is Shawnee's. Would it be possible to follow a cohort of students who are showing consistent attendance over 2 to 3 years and measure the improvement over a longer period of time? Mm-hmm. The intermediate and long-term effects of the interventions are critical to try to understand. And so so your basic idea, Shani, that we should follow kids over time and see whether the improvement lasts over a longer period of time is spot on. The challenge in these contexts is how mobile and transient some refugee populations are. Some aren't. There's some camps that have been there for a very long time, but there's been a lot of mobility. And the other part is raising the resources it would take to follow kids over time. We know two things. When we followed the kids in the Congo from the first year to the second year, the positive effects faded out in the second year. Mm-hmm. And that there are examples, not many in the literature, of what are called sleeper effects, where you don't see an effect to begin with, but you see an effect a couple years later. More common is you see an effect and it fades out over time. There's been a lot of work in early childhood trying to explain the persistence or fade out of intervention effects. And basically what that literature is beginning to suggest is that it's the quality of the new environments that kids are in that affect whether they maintain their prior progress or whether they slide back. So in work the center's been doing collaboratively with people in Ghana and other investigators, we've discovered that the effects of an early childhood program really differed depending on whether kids were going into high quality classrooms or low quality classrooms in the early school age years. So it's very common to see big changes over major developmental or school transitions. So the transition from early childhood to primary school, the transition from primary school to junior high school, all are periods of time where you could see different patterns of what we call continuity in a program effects or discontinuity in program effects. Yeon or Lindsay, anything you want to add to my response to Shani's question?
Yeah, so actually in our studies in Lebanon and Niger, there are a group of students who were attending for both years that we implemented the programs, not all of them. So we cannot do the experimental studies on them, but we can actually follow some of the kids who are enrolled in both years and attending at various level of the classes and see how the impact can be different for them. So that would be actually our next the research that we want to do with the data that we have.
Lindsay?
I guess the last thing I want to say about this, just as a point of awareness, is we had 5 different data cycles over the course of those 2 years, and we're through the work of our data team at the center have gotten a much faster and more effective at linking those students over time. But I want to be sort of transparent just for anybody who's in this line of work or thinking about this line of work, how time intensive it can be to link those students so that you can see their progress over 2 years when in environments where, they're not accustomed to that sort of tracking. And I don't know if Yeon or Larry want to say anything about that, but we, over time, have built an entire data team to do that sort of work because we know it's really important to develop, to follow children when we can over that sort of trajectory. But it has been a bigger task than I think any of us really envisioned at the beginning.
I don't want to say anything other than everybody's now been forewarned. So, okay. My last questions to Yeon and Lindsay, if you could respond briefly, each of you, to the following question. What are you most looking forward to doing next in this line of work? What is the most interesting or compelling thing you want to follow up on or question you want to answer? What should our colleagues who are still with us look forward to hearing from you about in the not too distant future?
I'll take that one first. So, based on the hypothesis that I spoke about, in terms of really capacitating teachers with the foundational skills that they would require to do this sort of work, I've been working on a project in Lebanon and more broadly with the idea of having teachers, having instructional leaders or teachers identify these core foundational practices for teachers and really creating a standardized way of talking and seeing these practices and having representations about what it looks like to do these things well and what that means for teachers' experience of professional development and ideally for their ability to acquire these sorts of foundational practices to help them enact any sort of curricular intervention that sort of comes their way. So we were working specifically with instructional dialogue because I think it's a great vehicle for so many of the things that we ask teachers to do in the classroom. So that's something that I've been working on that I will hopefully have more work on in the future.
And that will be terrific. Yeon.
I have two. So the first one is I am really excited actually to delve into the data we have and also to better understand how the child development works in this different context and how the social emotional learning looks like in the different contexts that we are working with, and actually developing, collaborating with the people in the ground, the teachers and students to better understand what is actually really helpful and what they need in terms of social emotional development to build a program and practices that are more contextually grounded is one of my next steps that I'm really focusing on. Another one is also similar to Lindsay, focusing on teachers. Teachers are often forgotten in the chain of delivery. We are often really focusing on the child, and the teachers themselves go through a lot of adversities working in this context as well. So we are also working on a program that is focused on providing mental health services and mental health support for the teachers in conflict-affected context, for them to be able to better cope with their stress and better deliver the services that we ask them to deliver with the better skills and mental health to do so. So those are two areas that I'm really excited about.
That's terrific. And I will mention one area for myself and one area for the center. The area for myself is I'm going to keep plugging away at this. How do we improve kids' social, emotional, and mental health outcomes? We mentioned that in the presentation, but I'm a double bottom line guy. Schools can't just advance kids' academic learning without advancing their social, emotional, and mental health well-being as well, and vice versa. And so kids are whole people, and we need to do everything we can to address their multiple learning outcomes. At a broader level, I'm looking forward to continuing to work on how university-based research centers can develop effective strategic partnerships with NGOs and government and in collaboration with donors and in collaboration with communities. The whole process of doing this kind of engaged, scientifically rigorous and informed, but deeply practical and culturally engaged research, that process and challenges are big to undertake. I can't think of a university that has more to offer than NYU in the sense that it's committed to being a global network university. And I'm also sure that if only NYU does it, we will fail as a society to grapple with what Yeon mentioned earlier in the UNHCR report is our collective responsibility, our truly global collective responsibility to change children's chances who are refugees and looking for an education. When we talk to parents, the most important thing they think of for their family moving beyond their refugee status is the education of their children. It is top of mind for parents and therefore an urgent global concern. We thank you again. We thank all our partners and strategic partners and collaborators. Thank you for your full attention. Remember that you can learn more about this and get the materials as was indicated in the chat. And we hope to be back in a year or three with more information to share if you so wish. Thanks and good day.